Thank you for joining Marianne Gebauer podcast. I am so delighted to be joined by Professor Ian Plimer from Australia. Good morning, Dr. Plimer.
Good morning to you, or as Australians say, g'day.
Good day. Well, you know what? You are iconic in the world of climate change in terms of imparting truth to the world. You're a well-known author. You are a geologist by trade, right? That's your original.
Yes, I am a geologist. I've been a geologist for more than 50 years, and I'm regarded as controversial because I use facts and I speak the truth. I mean, how dare I?
How dare you? Well, you have, I would say, a wonderful history in terms of academically. You have your Professor Emeritus, University of Melbourne. But prior to that, you were in Newcastle, and then you were in Munich, and you were in Melbourne, and then you were at University of Adelaide. So you have a very rich history academically. I understand that you were the editor of, now, is this the Encyclopedia of Geology, which
Yes.
sounds very impressive. You're the author of 130 scientific papers. And you are, to me, you're an authority on a lot of things academic, and you know how to read scientific papers.
Yes, well, I've had a wonderful career. I first started out working underground in a mine, and then I did a PhD, which was underground. Then I started at a junior level in universities teaching. Then once I was mid-level, I went and worked in the mining industry for a while. Then I went back to more senior level in the university. Then I moved to Newcastle. That was the first of my 4 chairs. And they were Newcastle, Newcastle, Munich, Melbourne, and Adelaide. And when I retired from Adelaide early, I then went back into the mining industry and basically used the accumulated scientific knowledge and experience that I have sitting on boards of various companies. And these are private companies. I don't do any public company work any longer, but I have sat on public company boards. So I've had a bit of a breadth in life. And what that has given me as a geologist is the opportunity to travel to all sorts of weird and wonderful places in the world. And people pay a fortune to go to one pristine area in the Andes. Well, I go there as part of work. I get paid to do it. And it's just a glorious life. And as a little side trip, you can go to the Galapagos. As a little side trip somewhere else, you can go here or there. And I've worked in the old world, in Greece and Turkey, and worked in the Muslim countries, Turkey, Iran, Saudi. I've worked in Africa, been able to see the worst of African politics, the worst of dictatorships. I've travelled extensively through the Soviet Union before it changed to Russia, worked and visited many times communist East Germany and communist Czechoslovakia, communist Poland. And so it gives you a distance and a breadth of knowledge, a lot of which is very hard to find in the literature, but I've been there and with my geological eyes been able to see things and look at things. So I have a great love of history, and I like to understand why, for example, the Minoan Empire was destroyed in a massive volcanic eruption, 1600 BC in Santorini, and how you can tie in the evolution of human growth to natural catastrophes, to great processes that have happened on planet Earth. And over time, I've been able to look at cultures and how climate has influenced a culture, why some cultures have broken up, why some have moved. And by reading the rocks, I've been able to see sea level changes, climate changes, ice ages. So it's been a wonderful period of accumulating knowledge, which I have put down in various books on climate. And the first climate book I wrote came out in 2009, and that was called Heaven and Earth. And that was a fairly dense book. Yeah, it's a dense book with a few thousand references.
That's right.
But there I intertwined geology, history, and archaeology. A very dense book, but I wanted to kill an ant with a hammer. I wanted to just destroy the scientific arguments, which really are not very valid. And since then, I've put out a few little books. A book called Not for Greens, and this was a book about a teaspoon. and how you couldn't possibly live in today's modern world without using masses of energy and using resources. And per capita, we use far more resources than people did 200 years ago. And then I put out a book, especially for the Australian market, called Climate Delusion and the Great Electricity Rip-Off. And that was before we really got ripped off. That was when prices doubled, now they quadrupled and going to quadruple again. And that was basically saying, look, we've got it all wrong, destroying our very efficient coal-fired and gas-fired electricity systems and replacing them with unreliable wind and solar, which are just not enough grunt to keep a technological society running. And then more recently, I wrote Green Murder. And Green Murder is a dense book. My publisher made me throw out 75 pages because of the binding can't handle it. And that book was written in the year 2020, and it was written under interesting circumstances. I was in a clinic getting treated for cancer, and I had infusions in me all day, every day for 10 months. And you can either sit there and moan or read a newspaper or watch some acidine program on television, or you can persuade the staff to convert one of their offices into a ward just for me, where I've got my computers, printers, screens, and 2 meters of reference material, and I can sit down and write a book rather than moaning and groan. I can actually write a book. So that was written while I was in a cancer clinic in Melbourne, and the results must have been good because I'm talking to you. And then things slipped backwards a bit, and I went to that clinic again early this year, and only spent 3 months there. And again, they were waiting for me, and they'd had my room prepared. And I thought, well, I've heard from a lot of people that it is the school children who are getting contaminated by political rubbish, by this climate change, eco-anxiety. So in the 3 months there, I wrote a trilogy of books. The first one is for 8 to 12-year-old kids, which I've called For Ankle Biters. The second one is for teens, and they're the ones who squeal and moan and groan and carry on about climate. And the next one is for post-teens, people who have left school and are interested in climate. And that trilogy was written again while I had infusions in me. Again, I had a pile of references, but 3 different languages, 3 different approaches to talking about climate. And that book appeared on the 19th of August this year, 2023, at a CPAC conference in Sydney. And we did a pretty big print run on the first print run, and it was sold out in 5 days. So we've now got a second print run, and we're now planning the third print run because I've got a lecture tour in Northern Australia next week, and I know that people are out there buying these. And it's basically written for parents and grandparents to deprogram their children from what their teachers have been telling their children, making the children very anxious. And basically the theme is, for the books for the more senior kids, is, look, we've seen it all before. This is what's happened in the past on the planet. We've seen it all before. It's not a crisis. We're not in a climate emergency. You're not going to die. You'll have a very rich life. And I compare the sort of life they're having with kids that I saw when I worked in Africa, with kids that I saw when I worked in South America, and said, look, this is your life. Have a look at how other kids your age live. Is that fair? And you know how teenagers are. They go and open the fridge and say, oh, there's nothing to eat. Well, I point out what they eat compared with kids in the rest of the world. And then kids of that age often will say, oh, that's not fair. Well, I talk about how fair it is. How fair is it that you can drive in an electric vehicle, whereas the cobalt in that vehicle that was mined to make your electric vehicle was mined by children in Africa? These are slaves. These kids die underground. They die in open pits. They die of cobalt poisoning. Is that fair that you should be using an electric vehicle that kills children your age? And the first one, the book For Ankle Biters, is a book written for kids from 8 to 12. And that was inspired by my 7-year-old grandson who lives in Canada. He lives in Montreal. And he proudly on FaceTime showed me a new book that he just got. And he was giggling away with a devilish laugh. And the book was called Do Girls Fart? Now, kids of that age really roll around in spasms of laughter about farts. Mm-hmm. So this book is written for that sort of humour. It's a book with a lot of coloured pictures in it. It's a book with humour about how you might eat a cookie. And when you eat a cookie, you metabolize, I don't use that word, of course, but you metabolize cookie into your cells, which make you grow, and you get rid of some of the carbon compounds that were in the cookie. You get rid of them with poo. And I go into what poo is and why you shouldn't handle it, and all the viruses and pathogens and bacteria in poo. I go into how a cow's stomach is different from that of a human stomach, and how there are big differences in what various animals poo out. I go into wee, and basically it's a health lesson to kids. Keep drinking your water, monitor the colour of your wee, but that yellow colour is actually due to the breakdown of various cells in your body, and these are carbon compounds. I go into picking your nose. I go into snot, what that's composed of, and how that is getting rid of carbon compounds. Earwax, how that's getting rid of carbon compounds. But about half the book is on farts, and it's along the chemistry of farts. And if you're going on a school excursion and you want to be the school fart champion, what do you eat before you go on a school excursion in the bus? And just remember, a fart travels at 10 kilometres an hour. So don't comment very quickly and say, ugh, because if you smelt it, you dealt it. So this is to have kids rolling around with spasms of laughter, having their parents and grandparents a bit embarrassed to read it. But basically, the message is that you eat carbon compounds, you excrete carbon compounds, you cannot have net zero carbon, you cannot demonize carbon dioxide because you breathe out 4% carbon dioxide, and what you're being fed is absolute rubbish. And so all books are done with humour, and all books are done trying to educate the young kids. Now, I know school teachers won't buy these books. I know they won't get into the school libraries unless parents donate them. So it's basically for parents and grandparents. Now, I've had people at CPAC conference in Sydney were buying these books for grandchildren who are yet to be conceived. So there's clearly a concern out there in the community that the long march through our education system by the left, by the communists, has actually succeeded. And our kids now are being influenced with all sorts of weird and wonderful views, which we've taken thousands of years to build up knowledge and build up systems. And then it's getting destroyed by ideology. And these kids are nervous. These kids are anxious. These kids don't want to live. These kids don't see a future. And I'm trying to tell the kids that the world is a wonderful place. There's a terrific future out there for you. So don't be worried.
Now, with teenagers, that is often a group that we have more difficulty as parents hitting messages home. What is the most compelling argument that you have found in your book? Because you do write a book specifically for teenagers. What is the take-home message?
The take-home message in the second one for teens is we've seen it all before. We have seen drought, and it's far greater than anything we experience today. We've seen wildfires, and they're far greater than anything we've seen today, and the wildfire intensity and number has been going down over the last 100 years. We've seen hurricanes, and the hurricane intensity is going down. The damage is getting a lot less because we are putting up better buildings. We've seen heavy periods of rain. We've seen times when it's been much, much warmer than now and much, much colder than now. So you are living on a planet where there's variability. Mm-hmm. And we've seen it all before. There is nothing to be worried about. The second message I give the kids is that these scary doom and gloom predictions are not based on people measuring things. They're based on models, people trying to work out what might happen in the future. And I go and talk about how no one has ever predicted the future. We've had for the last 2,000 years, people have been predicting the end of the world. Now, if just one of them got that right, we wouldn't be here.
Yeah.
So don't worry about the predictions and models. And so I give them heretical ideas like climate cycles show that the climate changes are due to the position of the continents and the Earth's addressing the galaxy and the orbit of the Earth and the variable amount of energy emitted by the sun. It's not related to the gas of life. And I spend quite a bit of time on the gas of life. I talk about Great Barrier Reefs of the past and the present, how these come, these go, but they've never, ever died due to a high amount of carbon dioxide or warm temperatures. And basically, it's a seditious book saying most of what you've been told is wrong. This is the way you can check up on it. Don't believe what you're told. Teenagers are rebellious, and I've been capitalising on that rebelliousness. I've been trying to get the teenagers to be a little bit rebellious at school and give them very simple questions to ask, like the best question of the lot. Well, that's very interesting. Can you please show me the evidence? So this is very much with teenagers in mind, having had teenagers, having taught teenagers for many years. They are rebellious. They don't want to listen to authority figures like myself. And I give them many things to work out for themselves. I give them many experiments. It's written in the style of a book that some parents might know, and that's the book's Horrible Histories, where there's drop downs, little coloured boxes, little pictures of something here, save the planet, and there I talk about the best way of saving the planet. I talk about the trees, how, for example, in Canada, the emissions of carbon dioxide by humans in Canada is a fraction of the absorption of carbon dioxide by the forests in Canada. So Canada's already at net zero. What have you got to worry about? I talk about volcanoes and what they emit. I talk about forest fires, how 75% of forest fires are as a result of arsonists. They're not from climate change. They're from people deliberately lighting fires or sparking machinery or power lines that have fallen down, like the recent ones in Hawaii. So we give a lot of little did you knows, a few little graphs just showing that there's nothing catastrophic going on. This is life is normal. And again, intertwined with a lot of humour, intertwined with a little bit of what they eat, and then saying, look, if you're really serious about climate change, you want to suggest to your teachers not to drive to school. Do your teachers live in a cave? Do your teachers go hunting and gathering? Do your teachers have a mobile phone, air conditioning, refrigerators, or a computer? Do your teachers walk everywhere? And wait for them to do it first before you follow. But if your teachers believe that this is the end of the world, we've got too many humans, well, they should drop off the planet first and then promise to follow. You know, I promise I'm going to go. So it's a book intertwined with humour, rebelliousness. It's a book trying to get teenagers a little bit angry. And there's nothing worse than an angry teenager, especially an angry teenage girl.
And what about the book for 20s and wrinkles? I think that's so clever the way you coined that. But what were the main messages in that book?
Well, this is a totally different book. This is a book on the history of the planet. And it's basically a very watered down story of the history of the planet based on my first year lectures at university. So I start with the beginning of the planet and saying it was a dark and stormy night on a Thursday, 4,567 million years ago. So I've got a lot of humour written in there. And on the first page, I asked the question, is the moon made of green cheese? And I give evidence that there is a green cheese, it's a Norwegian green cheese, that has the same earthquake wave velocity as moon rocks. Now, earthquake wave velocity we use to work out what the rock is. So I say, well, look, if we've got a Norwegian green cheese that has the same earthquake wave velocity as moon rocks, therefore the moon's made of green cheese. Now, that's an exercise in thinking. It's basically trying to tell the kids you can't use one line of evidence. You've got to use a double. And I get them to work out 5 reasons why the Earth is why the moon's not made of green cheese. And then I'll go into the atmospheres. The Earth has had 3 atmospheres, first of which was methane, ammonia, and hydrogen and helium rich. The second, which we had for the bulk of time, was very rich in carbon dioxide. It had more than 20% carbon dioxide in it. Yet we had ice ages. So how come? You're being told that high carbon dioxide drives global warming, yet we have ice ages. So this is just posing the question that we're being fed rubbish. I go into extinctions, mass extinctions, minor mass extinctions and major mass extinctions. I go into a great event where we started to have oxygen appear in the atmosphere, and that eventually led to our 3rd atmosphere. And our 3rd atmosphere is an oxygen-rich atmosphere, but over time, the oxygen content of the atmosphere has gone up and down by from about 35% to about 5%. It's currently at about 21%. At 35%, we had global forest fires because there was so much oxygen. We had complete denudation of the land, massive landslips, loss of vegetation. And when we had 5% oxygen, we had mass extinctions. So putting things into perspective, I look at how these atmospheres are telling us about the long ago. And in the long ago, before we had life like vegetation and like animals with shells and skeletons, we had a very high carbon dioxide content in the atmosphere. And then we started to draw this out of the atmosphere, and it went into limestones, it went into shells, it went into forests. And we have decreased in the last 500 million years, we've decreased from 0.7% carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to 0.04%. And I pose a question that you're Patrick Moore, who lives on Vancouver Island. Dr. Moore started Greenpeace and was kicked out a bit later when it was taken over by the communists. But Patrick Moore argues that, yes, we do have a crisis. It's a carbon dioxide crisis. There is not enough. And if we halved the atmospheric carbon dioxide content, vegetation would probably die out. And with that, we would have the end of life on Earth, and we'd have our 4th atmosphere. So Patrick Moore has raised the question and then given the solution, saying, well, we should be burning fossil fuels and burning coal.
Yeah. I
also look at periods of time of hysteria in the past. And I mentioned very briefly the Dutch tulip craze of the late 1600s. But I also look at the witch hunts. And witch hunts were during the Little Ice Age. That's when it was very, very cold. And during the Little Ice Age, from 1300 to 1850, we had extra cold periods. And these extra cold periods meant that there was crop failure, that there was starvation. And of course, someone had to be blamed for that crop failure. And so they picked on the women. And they called them witches, and they killed them. And there's a very good correlation between the number of witches that's killed. So I've got a diagram there showing how many witches were killed and when, and I've correlated that with temperature. And at the coldest period in the Little Ice Age, that's when the witch hunts took place. And when the witches had been killed, then the planet started to warm up. So obviously, it was witches that caused climate change. So, I mean, that's clearly illogical.
Yes.
And I then argue that you are living in one of these periods of mass hysteria today, where there's no logic, where people are doing really dumb things, and we can afford to do that because we're very, very wealthy. In the West, we're extraordinarily wealthy. And one of the economic evolutionary trends we see is often when we are extraordinarily wealthy, we don't retain that wealth. We waste it. We destroy it. And this is exactly what's happening in Western countries. I also then look at some of the features, the geological features and planetary features of climate change. And so I look at the cycles and the geological cycle every 400 million years, and the fact that sometimes you can have a continent that's parked in the wrong place for a long time. Gondwana was one of those continents. Then it broke up, but the last bit of that continent, Antarctica, is still parked over the South Pole. And until Antarctica moves, we will be in a very cold period. And we've been cooling down for 50 million years. The current ice age we're in started 34 million years ago. If you really want to change climate, you've got to move Antarctica. Then I look at the galactic cycles of every 143 million years, and there's been quite a bit of work done by Canadian and Israeli scientists on this. And every 143 million years, we get bombarded with cosmic radiation, and cloud base builds up. That reflects light and heat, and we cool down. And someone has checked that by having a research grant to go to every one of the great art galleries in the world. I mean, what a job. And to measure the proportion of clouds in landscape paintings at various times. And that correlates perfectly with the solar physics, that people noticed that there wasn't much cloud around, and these were the colder times. Then I go into the orbital cycles every 100,000 years, every 40,000 years, and every 23,000 or 41,000 years and 23,000 years. And our governments can't possibly change the orbit of the Earth. Our latest orbital